So if you're joining us, welcome. Please use the chat function to tell us your name, your organization, and where you're dialing in from. Right. I think it's time for us to get going. Really grateful you could make time to join us on what is a really important topic and one conversation that is advancing the whole world of impact investing beyond the normal data collection. I feel this is a really important conversation, especially try to strengthen and prove the value of impact and impact reporting. Consistently, I'm always being asked by the skeptic that, it's all well and good that we are driving towards impact investing, but what is the reality? What is the proof of concept that this is actually working? Where are some of the early indicators around this? So this is a really, really important topic for all of us. So I'm really excited you could make that to join us today. I want us to make this a really engaging session. So as Matt comes on after me, he'll tell you a bit more about how we'll run the show today, but I'm looking forward to a really engaging conversation. And as we walk through this, we'll also tell you a bit more about some of the other developments from AVPA. But this is a critical part of how we start taking our impact measurement and reporting to the next level. So this is really critical. Matt, thank you so much for being a host to this. We're really excited to be doing this with you. So over to you, Matt.
Thank you so much, Frank, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. Let me just share my screen and we can get started. So we'll be spending the next hour or so digging into these topics on screen. First of all, we'll give an overview of the current state of impact reporting practices. And the aim then will be to introduce you to the impact performance reporting norms, which were released in April this year and designed to improve the quality, credibility, and consistency of investor disclosures about their impact performance. But as I'll explain in a little bit, these reporting norms are currently in pilot phase. And over the next year, the idea is to really hear from all of you about what would help ease reporting burdens whilst increasing the usefulness of information contained in these impact reports. So as Frank was saying, we really want this to be interactive, engaging, and the objective is today is to provide you with some information, but also to listen to you and gather ideas. So as we go through the webinar, please do provide any suggestions, post questions, or ask for clarifications. We've got the chat window open, so please feel free to put in any questions as we go along, and we'll also pause for comment and reflection at key points throughout the webinar. Before I do that, just to introduce myself and our work. So my name is Matt Ripley. I'm a director at Impact Frontiers. We're a learning and market building collaboration for investors who are seeking to manage their social and environmental impacts and incorporate these impacts into their investment decision making. We provide peer learning opportunities and create practical tools that support investors in doing that impact management. But we also seek to use these practitioner experiences to jumpstart consensus building in areas of practice where maybe standards and guidance don't yet exist, and then synthesize and share the results of these consensus building efforts with the field at large. And the big focus of our field building efforts at the moment is on impact reporting, which is what we'll be talking to you about today. And we're really delighted to be partnering with AVPA on this initiative as part of a project funded by the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. So let's start by setting the scene on the current state of impact performance reporting. Before I do that, I'd like to ask you all a question. And don't worry about getting the exact right answer here. Just put in your best guess. I'd love for you to share in the chat a percentage. And that percentage is the proportion of impact investors who you think report that their impact performance meets or exceeds expectations. So what do you think? Somewhere between 0 and 100? What's proportion of impact investors have investments that are meeting or exceeding their expectations? Right, we're getting a range of figures in here, all the way from the lows of the 20% up to the highs of the 90%. Yes, and this is slightly a trick question, and some people are cheating because they've done this exercise with me before. Yes, it is, according to the most recent, and now it's slightly updated, most recent GIN Impact Investors Survey, it is 90%. That's 90%. So only 4% of investors reported that their impact performance is underperforming relative to expectations, and 6% are unsure. Now, some of you got close to that figure. Most of you were getting a little bit below. And every time we raise this figure, we often see these comments that I'm seeing in the chat box around surprised, because it's quite a striking figure, 90%. And it probably reveals less about the actual impact performance of the investments they're making, and probably tells us more about the challenges investors face in setting appropriate expectations for their impact performance and assessing whether their investments are truly achieving their impact objectives. So while impact investing has made really big strides over the past few years in terms of increasing the volume of global impact capital, although there is still plenty of scope for progress, as well as making progress in terms of putting in place process standards and practice standards to manage towards impact, the next frontier is really to focus on actual outcomes and shift the conversation towards impact performance itself. And impact reporting is long been a cornerstone of impact investing, along with impact measurement more broadly. And you'd be right to think that these reports are the natural place for investors to communicate the impact performance of their underlying investments. But the consultancy firm Bluemark ran a study a few years ago on the current state of investor impact reporting. And they found a global landscape where both the impact funds writing the reports and the asset owners reading the reports were pretty unhappy. The impact funds writing the reports feel overwhelmed by all the data requests, sometimes and often contradictory data requests coming from their capital providers. And those capital providers were often receiving and reading reports, but moaning about the lack of comparability in reporting from all of the funds that they're investing in. And as well as that, the information that impact funds are putting into reports can often be seen as partial, not clearly presented. And over time, asset owners starting to doubt the veracity, the credibility, and the reliability of those performance disclosures, often seeing these documents more akin to a marketing and promotion document rather than providing any great insight into the impact that's being generated on the ground. And that's a problem because, as we know, the scale of the social environmental issues that many of these impact investors are setting out to address can be vast. As many of you know, for example, just a stat that by some estimates, there's the need to create about 20 million jobs each year just to absorb the young expanding workforce on the African continent. But to unlock the benefits of things like this youth bulge, in terms of innovation potential, creative energy, a growing consumer base, what we really need to do is focus that conversation on how we're progressing towards these goals and not just telling people about the good intentions and the promises. So I'd like to invite Frank to share a few reflections on the importance of getting impact reporting right from a AVPA perspective, and then I'll pick up in more detail on what we've been doing in terms of the work on the impact performance reporting norms. So Frank, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. This has become a real need for us as we listen to our broader network of partners in terms of where are some of the gaps that they see. For those of you who joined us for our conference in Nairobi in November, will realize that we had a couple of sessions and masterclasses around the impact measurement and reporting. Matt's run one really cool one and a session around what he's talking about today. We had someone else run a session on IMM. And generally, we also had another session where we're trying to help the private sector get better at purpose-led strategies where we're converging profit and purpose. So to that end, one of the things we also launched at the conference was our SDX, our Africa Social Impact Exchange, which has 4 pillars in it. The $200 million catalytic pool fund that I think you've all probably seen in our social media and newsletters and other platforms. And then we had a second platform, a second pillar on deal sharing and impact measurement, a third pillar on investor readiness, and a fourth pillar on data collection to support impact reporting policy and practice. So it's going to be a focus area for us going forward, and one that we want to support. Would like to hear from you what help you need in more specificity, because we are very responsive in how we help you do what you do better, faster, cheaper, and with more impact. And but I just want to let the audience know that it's an area we're focusing on quite significantly going into next year, and we are trying to find the right partners to potentially run 1 or 2 capacity building programs to the benefit of the network. So that's stuff I just want you guys to look out for in 2025. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Frank. So if we set out the current state of affairs and the problem that reporting norms is designed to address, and simply put, it is that reporting at the moment is something that most of us, if not all of us, do, but it seems unnecessarily burdensome for those writing reports and not as useful as it could be for those reading the reports. So the impact performance reporting norms really try and address that issue. And they set out to reach consensus about the content, structure, and format of impact performance reports with a number of aims. Firstly, as I was saying, to make reporting less onerous for those writing the reports, more useful for those reading the reports. Particularly to facilitate the flow of impact information so that it can inform decisions about investment and engagement on the part of those asset owners, but also to create open access, non-proprietary criteria against which independent reviewers can assure, evaluate, or verify impact performance reports and their quality. And finally, to offer a market-tested prototype for future impact performance disclosure standards by voluntary standard setters and perhaps even national regulators. I'll explain in a second the consultation process we went through and the pilot process we continue to go through for these reporting norms. But what I'd say is that, all of these problem statements is not because everyone's trying to do a bad job of reporting. It's actually what we heard from all the investors we spoke to is that, everyone wants to do a good job of impact reporting and they want to do the right thing, but it's not always clear how or what the right thing is. So this is really a starting point. We know it's not easy, but the whole objective is to try and make it easier for everyone to report impact performance, to shift that conversation to focus on not just impact processes, but impact performance and results on the ground. So we did start this process in 2023 with a pretty comprehensive review of the landscape of reporting standards on one hand and assurance standards on the other. We ran a public consultation and released version 1 of the reporting norms in April this year. And I'll share the link to the website in a second where you can read the full version of the reporting norms as well as a much shorter summary. At the moment, we are in a 2-year implementation phase to pilot the norms. And we have over 150 investors at the moment actively using the reporting norms while drafting their reports. Later on, I'll tell you about how to get involved in this free pilot program and join that community of investors should you wish. But before I do that, I'll give a little bit more detail around what we actually mean by impact performance reporting norms. So by norms, we mean something less formal and less prescriptive than a standard. So more like a shared expectation or typical practice. If they were a standard, they would be a reporting standard for investors, because there's no such thing as a reporting standard for investors right now. For instance, IRIS Plus, that many of you might know and use, is a thematic taxonomy and it includes standardized metrics, but it doesn't say what information an impact report should include or what it should look like. And by norms, we mean something that can be implemented in whole or in part in a flexible way. So maybe the best way to think about norms is a voluntary social contract that report preparers, so general partners, impact funds, and asset owners, so limited partners, can use as scaffolding that will enable them to have a more decision useful conversation about impact performance of these funds. And by impact performance, here we simply mean results, not practices. And this is certainly not to disparage the incredible work that's been done on standards for impact management practice in the impact investing space. And there are great principles and standards out there, such as the SDG impact standards and the impact principles. And in the norms, we just point to those. But the reporting norms are about moving to that next logical step after impact management practices, what's happening on the ground. And I think the thing to say here, and I've mentioned the word flexibility earlier, and I'll keep coming back to that time and time again, is that we know it's not easy to get this kind of performance data and performance information, and therefore to disclose it. So inbuilt into the norms, and hence a fairly long 2-year pilot and implementation phase, is that expectations are going to need to be commensurate with fund size to avoid disadvantaging smaller or emerging fund managers. So all of these norms aim to strike a balance between standardization and flexibility. I'll provide a little bit more detail now about the content of the norms in the next few slides, and then I'll pause for questions. The first step for anything about reporting is to really establish that shared understanding of who is the user of the report and what's their purpose in reading the report. The norms are framed in this way, that the primary users of an impact performance report are assumed to be the providers of capital, i.e. the asset owners and allocators. And the objective of those primary users is assumed to be seeking to understand the impacts of the entity, in other words, the impact fund, and the underlying investee companies on the well-being of end stakeholders and the natural environment, so that those users, those asset owners, can make investment and engagement decisions that are informed by the experiences and interests of end stakeholders and the natural environment. And it seeks to bridge that gap that we all know exists in the investment value chain, as you can see on the left, between those with capital who sit at the top part of that chain and the affected communities, like the people on planet, at the bottom. And it's a very intermediated chain. And it's sometimes very, very difficult for those deploying capital and making capital allocation and engagement decisions to know what is happening on the ground. There can be many other users as well, and potential other users from marketing and internal purposes, but the norms are very much framed from the perspective of these primary users and the purpose of impact performance reporting. The next part of the norms really provides the scaffolding for what to report. Think of this as the basic recipe that impact investors should follow when they sit down to write an impact report. In the norms, we suggest 6 sections and general types of content in each section, and I'll go through these very briefly now. The first is entity overview and impact thesis. So this is pretty much who you are and what you're trying to do as an impact fund. It includes things like stakeholder identification, materiality analysis, and who is experiencing the impact, what impacts they're experiencing, and how important those impacts are to them. The second section is impact management process. So this is how you're trying to do it. In other words, your impact management practices of the investor. The third section is really the meat of the reporting norms. It's what actually happened. In other words, it's the real world results generated in the reporting period. And the performance reporting norms are framed from the perspective of assuming an annual reporting period, recognizing that some organizations may report less frequently and some may report more frequently than that. The fourth part of the norms is governance. So that's governance of impact management. And that's all adapted from the governance questions of the International Sustainability Standards Board, so ISSB, just reframed with an impact materiality lens instead of a financial materiality lens. The fifth section of the reporting norms are case studies designed to bring impact performance to life for a sample of investments, and the norms provide some granular guidance on how to disclose the logic behind the selection and presentation of case study material in an impact performance report. And the sixth and final section of the reporting norms that's optional is around independent review, which could be assurance of the data contained in the impact report or verification of alignment of the impact report with the norms themselves. The norms don't require or assume that any investor will pursue independent review or prescribe what type of independent review they should seek. That's a decision best left to report preparer in discussion with their report users, hence being an optional part of the reporting norms. We suggest in the reporting norms that that is the structure to follow in your own impact reports, those 5 and potentially a 6th optional section. And that is pretty much as far as the standardization goes in the impact performance report in terms of the structure. So it does leave a lot of the granular specifics left to the discretion of the report preparers, which brings us to the next slide. So under each of those 6 sections, the norms provides guidance about what information to include, but not necessarily how to present that. So here's an example on screen you can see from section 3 of the impact performance reporting norms, and it covers things like outcomes, targets, thresholds, data disaggregation, in addition to recommended disclosures and explanations around performance. And that's a pretty similar format that's shared throughout the rest of the norms. And as I said, this is about the level of granularity and standardization that the norms goes into. So you can think of the reporting norms as a high-level recipe that's trying to codify expectations around the content and structure of these impact performance reports, but not prescribing exactly what type of data information should be included. Therefore, it is deliberately allowing for flexibility based on individual circumstances and context. What I would say is that the norms encourages all of those preparing impact reports to try as hard as possible to include all the information suggested in norms, but recognizing, as I said earlier, they're going to be judgment calls about how and what information to include. So if you're not including information suggested in the reporting norms, the idea is to provide a rationale as to why not. And that's referred to as a comply or explain approach. All of this content came out of the consultation phase that I was mentioning earlier. Our conversation was over 300 investors around the world, and it represents the broad consensus as there is at the moment around what should be in an impact report to be able to allow those capital allocators to make those investment and engagement decisions based on the interests and experiences of end stakeholders. So let me pause there for any questions or comments on the content and structure, the norms themselves, before I move on to some more guidance on how to report. And please feel free to come off mute and onto the mic or to put any questions in the chat as we go along. And yes, to the question about the recording, there will be a recording shared afterwards. Okay. And it will include slides as well. So let's move on to how to report. So you might be thinking, well, these norms, they leave quite a lot of discretion to those preparing reports. How will the people writing an impact report actually know what information to include? Well, the norms also include a set of principles, and these are based on what's known as the characteristics of useful information. And these are principles to guide report preparers. And they take over where the standardization in the content and structure of impact performance reports leaves off. Think of them basically as the way to decide what information to present and how to present it. I'm going to go through each of these in turn. But basically, there are two fundamental characteristics, relevance and faithful representation, and four enhancing characteristics. And I'll explain the difference between fundamental and enhancing as well. But before I do, just for those familiar, to say that these characteristics of useful information are exactly the same principles used in financial reporting, and specifically in a foundational document called the Conceptual Framework for Financial Reporting, produced by the International Accounting Standards Board. All we've done here is reinterpret them in the context of impact. And to say these principles are also now underpinning sustainability reporting, in that the same characteristics are used in both ISSB standards and the EU's sustainability reporting standards. So the idea is that there's a golden thread or a shared foundation between financial sustainability and impact reporting. So I'll briefly go through each of these. Again, the slides will be shared afterwards, and the full norms document has much more guidance and detail on what each of these mean in practice. But the first fundamental characteristic is relevance. So the norms suggest that relevance should be defined from the perspective of stakeholders and aspects of the natural environment experiencing the impact. Again, under the assumption that the information could, in principle, influence the decisions of asset owners and allocators. Information here might make a difference in a decision, even if some users choose not to take advantage of it or are already aware of it from other sources. And in the box at the bottom, you can see an example of a reporting practice that would follow the characteristic of relevance and one that would not. So in the first example, the little tick, even if an investor is choosing not to include targets for each reported metric, it's okay as long as the report is able to provide a clear rationale to the reader as to why they're not doing that. But in example 2, the little X in the box, the risk of including excess information, substantial filler information, by doing that, the report actually risks obscuring a user's view of what information is actually material or not. So that's the principle of relevance to decision-making use. The second fundamental characteristic is faithful representation. That basically means information provided should, as far as possible, be complete, neutral, and accurate. Complete basically means including all outcomes and impacts that are known or could reasonably be expected to be known. Now, as you're probably thinking, oh my goodness, that's an awful lot. Complete information is rarely available or cost-effective to obtain. And the conceptual framework and these principles recognize the cost constraint on reporting. So again, it's based on judgment required to gauge how much completeness in granularity is appropriate in light of the cost of obtaining and disclosing that information, but also in light of the significance of impacts from the perspective of stakeholders in the natural environment and the relevance. So the previous characteristic, the relevance of that information to users of the report. Neutral means there's no bias in the way that information is selected or the way it's presented. That basically means there's no conscious or unconscious manipulation of the information in the report to make it more likely that users of the report will read the information and performance more positively or negatively. in impact investing and in impact management in particular, it's important to be careful about how we use terms like bias and neutral. A representation that appears to be neutral and unbiased in a report preparer or to users may not appear so to others. Obviously, bias can sometimes be fairly subjective. So here goes back to the function of independent review, that actually getting outside or a second opinion on the report to check for bias and neutrality from different perspectives. Having reports reviewed by individuals who are maybe not involved in the management of the fund is actually an interesting way to get feedback on and mitigate the risk of potential biases. And as for accuracy, well, that's free from material misstatement or error, but that doesn't mean everything needs to be perfectly precise. Again, we know in any social or environmental change context, things are not going to be necessarily exact, but as precise as possible. So these are the main tenets of faithful representation. And in the box, again, you can see example reporting practices. So estimates are fine. So that tick, that's completely fine to put in estimates as long as they're explained. And ideally, if those estimates or ranges are so the estimates are uncertain, to favor possible understatement of impact over overstatement impact. A practice that would not likely adhere to the characteristic of faithful representation would be a report that leaves out entirely any potential negative impacts. And here the term negative impacts can refer to both outcomes that are beneath an acceptable or sustainable level or threshold, or to outcomes that worsen significantly during the period. So a report that's solely slanted towards intended positive impacts, but doesn't mention at all any negative impacts may likely not meet the test of faithful representation. Let me pause here for any questions on the two fundamental characteristics. I see we have a couple of questions on, or one on the principles approach in general, more of a comment, and then one on how much time it takes if an independent review is sought. I think that's going to depend a little bit on who is doing the independent review and the scope of that review exercise. Typically, a data assurance of the actual underlying performance data will take a little bit longer, but a review of the structure of an impact performance report should be quicker. We've seen timelines, between 4 to 6 weeks to get a full verification and review of an impact report, sometimes less. So it doesn't have to be a significant amount of time. The lesson learned we've seen there is that as long as those preparing impact reports build it into their timeline and process for finalizing reports, the cycle can run fairly smoothly. Okay. So on to the enhancing characteristics. So think of the fundamental characteristics as the two most important, and the enhancing characteristics as important, but if there is a conflict between fundamental and enhancing characteristics, it's the fundamental characteristics that win out every time. So think of these next four as almost the nice to haves. They're not the need to haves, because the absolute need to haves are going to be those two fundamental characteristics. The first one is here in the enhancing characteristic is comparability. So comparability allows for comparison of information between different entities, so i.e. between different impact funds or between different periods for the same fund. Comparability can come in many different forms, things like consistency of concepts being measured, i.e. using goal-based taxonomies like the SDGs. A point of reference for comparison can be a target, can be a baseline, And comparability can be boosted by just having consistency in the structure and format of reports over time, which really helps readers know what to expect when they're getting the same, the report that looks roughly the same year on year. And this is a characteristic that basically enables users to identify and understand similarities in and differences among items. So it's important to note that comparability is not uniformity. Everything does not need to look exactly the same. Similar things need to look similar. Different things need to look different in the jargon of the characteristics is useful information. The next enhancing characteristic is verifiability. So that basically means information can be checked and confirmed, and that helps to give users confidence that the information is complete, neutral, and accurate. And the next enhancing characteristic is timeliness. And timeliness basically means that information is available in time to influence users' decisions. Generally, the older the information is, the less useful it is. And timely information ensures that the data reflects current impact performance and the level of outcomes being experienced by people and planet. But we know, again, that there's often a lag in terms of how data is collected and how it is reported and then used to inform decision-making. So some information may continue to be timely long after the end of a reporting period because, for example, some users may need to identify and assess trends. So it's not always point-in-time data that is timely, but actually presenting data points over time series and trend analysis that could actually help the timeliness of data. As I said before, in terms of frequency, impact reporting typically is at least annually, but preparers can determine a different frequency is appropriate. One thing we would say is that particularly for any disclosure around negative impacts, they're best disclosed and responded to promptly to mitigate harm, even outside of typical impact reporting cycles. So that maybe that information is communicated from impact funds to asset owners outside of regular reporting cycles to ensure timeliness. And finally, the last enhancing characteristic is understandability. So understandable information enables any reasonable and knowledgeable user to be able to readily comprehend the information being communicated. So the information should be presented clearly and concisely. For instance, impact reports avoiding generic or duplicative information while presenting a complete picture. And clarity might be enhanced by distinguishing information about kind of developments in the reporting period from standing information that remains relatively unchanged. So actually one of the big tricks of the reporting norms is to try and say, well, look for content that is evergreen, it doesn't change too much from one report to the next. Don't keep including it in your subsequent impact reports, just footnote it and say see previous impact report to try and save space, because ultimately no one wants an impact report to be 50, 100 pages long. Again, what's going to both alleviate the reporting burden, but also increase the decision usefulness of reports is relatively short, succinct reports, but are full of material information that actually relates to impact performance over the reporting period, rather than, as I was saying earlier, that substantial filler or boilerplate information that's not necessarily going to be illuminating of impact performance. So let me pause there for any questions, both about the enhancing characteristics, but impact reporting more broadly. And Brooke, I see a question from you. Would you like to, I don't know if you'd like to speak to that and to come off mute if you're happy to.
Yeah, happy to come off mute. Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. So yeah, I think my question was just so I'm like in the process of producing our first year report, and we are trying to think about, like, as we're going along, how it's going to progress through the years. But there's also I can see us, like, obviously getting better and better at it, and maybe deciding, next year, we shouldn't maybe have reported on that. This information is more decision useful, but also our theory of change has like multiple kind of intended outcomes and impacts, and with only kind of making progress to a few of those at the moment, but over time there'll be like a wider range of activities, I guess, to report on. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out the balance between like comparability between previous versions of reporting and getting that like consistency right, but also the need to kind of work on making improvements and getting better at it as each year.
Yeah, that's a great question, and illustrates as well that tension that sometimes exists between the fundamental characteristics of useful information and the enhancing characteristics. So if we just use these as a guide, comparability is great, but it will always be trumped by relevance and faithful representation. So what the norms would suggest in these guiding principles is that, you know, if there are things you're doing that are going to be relevant to the decisions that the users of a report are making, and that's going to involve a bit of a learning journey in terms of what information is going to be most relevant for them, it's much more important to change year on year to make sure you've got relevant information that's a faithful representation of impact performance, rather than it is to have a fully comparable report year on year. So those fundamental characteristics would win out over comparability, at least in the short term.
Cool, thank you.
Super. I see a question from Mark as well in the chat. Mark, would you be happy to come off mute and on mic and share the question with the group?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon. I hope you can hear me.
Oh, we can indeed.
Great. So I come from the delivery perspective. I don't write reports. I'm not investing in. From the impact side, if you like, running programs on the ground. The time frame of investing has always been interesting for me. In traditional investing, it's short-termism wins. Impact investing, of course, it requires longer time frames. It's kind of a two-part question. What is the general, what is the mix, or what is the typical time frame for investments that investors in the impact space expect? Is there data on that? And whatever the answer to that question, is there room for guidance on how timeframes from investment to full sustained impact is reported on? Is there room for not only giving us some idea of what is the best practice in that space, but also perhaps encouraging further this idea that impact investment does often require a little bit more time to see true sustained impact?
Thanks, Mark. That's such an important question. And if I can, go back all the way to there we go, the content and structure, the reporting norms. Depending on the social environmental issue being addressed, depending on the geography, the asset class, the strategy, you're absolutely right. There's going to be a lot of variables and a lot of different timeframes between, if we can think of the theory of change from the inputs that are being provided, so the investment capital, technical assistance, all the way through to those longer term outcomes and impacts. The reporting norms is deliberately broad in saying that report preparers are encouraged to report as far down the impact pathway as possible and as far down as makes sense in their given context. And that given context can be, well, maybe it's a early stage venture fund that's only just started out making investments, therefore they can only report on perhaps some products or services delivered by portfolio companies, and it's too early to report on outcomes. In other instances, it might be actually that outcomes can be realized, say, for instance, maybe in affordable housing a lot quicker in terms of tenant feedback, things like that can actually be included a lot more rapidly. But what it should be doing is aligning what's being disclosed with the theory of change and the time horizons that are associated with that theory of change actually coming into fruition. So one of the key parts in the detail of section 1, as you see on screen, of the entity overview, is the impact thesis and actually clearly explaining that impact pathway all the way through from investment activities to end outcomes. And those can be direct outcomes on defined stakeholder groups, or as you were mentioning there, Mark, more systemic, system-wide outcomes. What does that look like? And then there should be a logical connection between what's being disclosed in section 3 on impact performance and the intended objectives and outcomes that are being sought and related timeframes that are set out in section 1. So yes, absolutely, it needs to be calibrated. And oftentimes, as I mentioned at the beginning, these are big, tricky, sticky, wicked problems, and certainly will take almost generations possibly to realize, recognizing that in some instances, an investment vehicle would typically or often be bound by, say, a 10-year investment horizon. But there is no expectation that a report in year 1 is going to need to or going to be able to report significant long-term outcomes when they're going to take time to be realized.
Sure, thank you. So steps towards impact are as equally valid within the report as to the actual outcome itself. Is there, if I'm may just quickly press is there an average or to a typical time horizon that impact investment makes? I'm assuming that the impact investment market is longer term thinking than the traditional sort of venture investment market. Is that right?
Longer term thinking, yes, or exactly. And in terms of the time horizon, I mean, typically funds will be asking for 5 to 10 years. A lot will actually then be putting in place ex post measurement so that they can start to or think about tracking outcomes even after that particular investment vehicle has ended. And I would say, back to your point earlier, yes, the norms encourage, if things like proxies are being used, i.e. using an output or an activity metric as a proxy for outcomes, those would absolutely fine and often appropriate as long as they're disclosed and the rationale is provided as to why. Maybe data doesn't exist, or maybe just there's already really good evidence that suggests if you produce output X, it's likely that in 5 years' time, outcome Y will appear. Again, as long as that is clearly described to allow the reader to be able to interpret outcome performance and impact performance in the report, that's absolutely fine.
Amazing, thank you. Great session so far.
Super. There were a couple of questions that came out, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to answer them in the registration form that you kindly provided for this webinar. And I'm just going to answer these 3 now because I thought there were 3 great questions. The first is, what are the effective impact reporting tools that portfolio companies can use to measure impact? So an investor is only going to be able to report largely what a portfolio company gives to them. So the reporting norms themselves, because they're set at the investor level, they're designed to be deliberately interoperable with initiatives such as the Impact Disclosure Task Force, and their new guidelines that outline a 5-step process that businesses themselves can follow to measure and disclose the development impact of their strategies. Companies can also use things like the SDG impact standards for enterprises, but think of it like an interlocking system. The reporting norms themselves do not get to the level of data collection and reporting at the portfolio company level, but they are interoperable with a number of initiatives that are ongoing at the company level to improve company and corporate measurement and reporting. The second question is, how do you recommend balancing qualitative insights with quantitative metrics? Another great question, and I think this is one that that comes up time and time again. And so the norms recommend a combination of both qualitative and quantitative information in impact reports, with neither being preferable to the other. Why is this? Well, because including both qualitative and quantitative data can strengthen reporting by potentially balancing the limitations of each approach. And while qualitative data is pretty well established and understood in the social sciences, it's still definitely an emerging practice in the field of impact measurement for investors. But qualitative data, as we all know, or many of us know, can be really important in helping understand the complexities and nuances of those stakeholder experiences that might not be possible to capture just with the numbers. And to say that qualitative data analysis can be just as rigorous as quantitative, and it does actually help, including in the report, to provide those in-depth insight into the stakeholder perspectives that we heard time and time again from the asset owners reading the reports, that yes, they wanted, the data, the numbers, but they also wanted those in-depth insights into the stakeholder perspectives. And the third question is, what's the difference in ESG and impact reporting? So typically, investors use ESG to refer to social and environmental issues that are financially material. In other words, ESG reporting only covers disclosures about social and environmental issues that affect investment returns. So if a company is having a positive or negative effect on a community, but that isn't material to financial performance, then those effects aren't in scope of ESG reporting. Impact reporting, in contrast, actually seeks to include all the impacts that are significant from the perspective of stakeholders and the natural environment. So it has a broader scope and remit than ESG reporting, which is often just bounded by financial materiality. Okay. I am going to spend the last 5 minutes on next steps. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, we are in an implementation phase at the moment. So lasting for a couple of years, we are piloting the norms with 150 investors to produce those first generation of impact performance reports following the norms. We have a series of monthly webinars that you are very welcome to join. Please just write directly to me or to info@impactfrontiers.org, and we can sign you up to those webinars. If you can't join them, we have a website where you can listen to the recordings. And we also have a help desk for norms aligned reporting. In other words, if you have a question about your impact report and you want some feedback on how you can follow the guidance in the norms, we are happy to offer pro bono advice. At the same time as the pilot, we are looking to adapt the norms. The norms at the moment are focused very much on the private market context. We are adapting them for use in public markets and for use specifically by development and finance institutions and the foundation and philanthropic space. And we are also running a series of parallel work streams, really digging into some of the areas of reporting that people find most challenging. Things like qualitative data, as I was mentioning before, how to make sure stakeholder views and voices are incorporated into the reporting process. And as some of the questions we're asking about earlier, what do independent review actually look like and how to do that? And in the final few minutes, if you do have any questions, I would very much welcome them still. But otherwise, if you do have ideas of resources that would actually help you on your own journey of improving the quality, credibility, consistency of impact reporting, and particularly with reference to the reporting norms, what would help you? And what could we work with you in doing to make it easier to prepare reports, but also more decision useful to read reports? Vincent has put a question in the chat that I can answer very briefly. So yes, as well as the over 350 investors we spoke to as part of the consultation phase of the norms, we've worked closely with our fellow field builders in the impact investing space, the impact investing, operating principles for impact management, the Global Impact Investing Network, the GIN, as well as AVPA. We are partnering with AVPN in Asia, Impact Europe, and a number of other membership organizations and associations to develop the norms. And our vision is that it is a shared resource by and for the sector and a community resource rather than being proprietary to any one organization. So if anyone would like to get involved, anyone has ideas about ways we can make it easier for you to adopt or road test the norms, we would love to work with you and to hear from you. other than that, Frank, I don't know if you'd like to say any closing words.
Yeah, Matt, thank you so much. This is the second time I'm listening to you present these, and they sound more exciting every time I listen to them. And I think it's about making steady progress and raising the bar with regards to the tools available for us to be better at what we do. So I'm a big fan of these norms, Matt. And as we look at doing our own catalytic pool fund, and as I mentioned, one pillar is really around impact data collection, impact reporting. AVPA will be looking to see how we can embrace these and promote these within the ecosystem. So you can count on us as one of the organizations that for sure going to be looking at how we can embed this into the ways of working within AVPA. So we're totally grateful for what you've put together, and we'll continue at AVPA to bring you thought leaders like Mark, who are able to upgrade your competencies in with the latest information. And Matt, thank you so much for your time. Really grateful. For those who we won't speak again, happy holiday season. Enjoy your break during Christmas. We'll be back with more in the new year. Matt, once again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all so much for participating, and have a great holidays.
Thank you, everyone. Let's connect on LinkedIn and stay in touch as well, everyone. Thank you so much.